Just be. Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds! Hello, nerds!
Hello, nerds!
Rev Wendy Hamilton, welcome to the Nerd Zone. How are you today?
I can't believe it. I finally made, Mama, I have made it to the Nerd Zone. I have made it. That's it. I'm good.
It's a rite of passage. We try to get as much Yang Gang through the Nerd Zone as we can. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm feeling really good today, Tom. It's just a beautiful day. We're 16 days out, hopefully, from changing the world. Andrew's back out on the trail. I mean, what else can you ask for?
I know, it's so cool seeing him back out on the trail, right? You're like, oh, part of me was like, oh, what could have been, but we won't go there.
Right.
He's still a young fella. It's not like this was his only chance.
Right. It just, brought me back so many, wonderful memories about being out there on the trail. And I was talking about it this morning. And I thought it seems so long ago. And yet that was like earlier this year.
I know. It's like a lifetime away. Well, where are you joining us from, Rev?
I live in Washington, D.C.
Oh, excellent. So you are seeing all of the activity in the White House and Congress up close and personal. That's your hometown.
I live in the belly of the beast. I've lived here. I've lived my whole adult life here, really. I'm originally from Ohio.
Mm-hmm.
Go Buckeyes, because I'm still a Buckeye fan. I went to high school, born and raised there. I actually came to D.C. to go to Howard University back in 1980. And and I have been in D.C. ever since.
What did you study at Howard?
So my undergraduate degree was actually in human development and early childhood education. I thought I was going to go into teaching originally, which is funny because I started out as a nursing major. So my mother, when I was growing up and thinking about coming to college and talking about what I might major in, I always had an interest in communications. I didn't know what communications was, but I just liked to talk, and I figured that meant communications. But growing up in the small town where I was from, near Appalachia, it's called Portsmouth, Ohio. It's on the Ohio River and shares tri-state area with Kentucky and West Virginia. So I had this accent that I worked very hard to get over, but it slides out every now and again. But anyway, back in those days, in my mom's experience and perspective, she says to me, well, when you go to college, you can only major in nursing or education. Black people can only be teachers or nurses. Black women. At that time, that was her understanding. So I said, well, I've been doing some teaching because I've been working at some childcare centers and things like that. So I thought I'd try nursing. And I did nursing for one semester, and that was about it for me. The blood and the anatomy class and having to go and examine a cadaver. Yeah, that was not the direction. So I went into teaching early childhood education and human development.
And then out of school, did you pursue that teaching career? Or?
For a little bit, I worked like in Head Start for a long time with young children and families, family advocacy. So yeah, I did follow out the human development route, but that desire to do communications never left me. And then, of course, with greater understanding and exposure, and especially when I moved to Washington, D.C., it was a culture shock for me. I had never seen that many people of color. I had never seen that many people of color in professional positions. And so it was a huge adjustment in my mind and in my thinking that maybe perhaps I could be more than a teacher or a nurse, and I could pursue other things. And so I credit that experience coming to Howard, in particular, a historically Black college and university, for completely changing the trajectory of my mind, shifting my paradigm. And so from there, I did start to pursue, even though I finished with the early childhood, I started to explore other opportunities and ultimately started my own kind of little public relations and PR firm at one point, and did some communications on the side, although I was still always sort of connected to education. You're muted, Tom.
So sorry. I'm a professional, I promise. What was it like being at Howard as a woman in the 80s? Because I remember when I went to college in the 90s, not too long after you, there was a little bit of a gender imbalance in many colleges and universities. Did you see that at Howard as well?
Not at all. I mean, actually, and just I think some of that has to do with DC in general, but I think the women to men ratio at that time was somewhere between 7-1 and 9-1, believe it or not. And
so there were more women than men.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Which made dating interesting. But in the African American community in particular, and even to this day, more Black women pursue higher education than Black men do, just from a numbers and a data perspective. And a lot of that is historical and has to do with barriers and obstacles that have been put in place. And sometimes also Black men being encouraged to go to the workforce and take care of the families, and the women being encouraged to get an education, to be able to assist in the household. And so you will see historically that Black women have a tendency to be more educated in that sense, because we were given more permission and more encouragement to pursue higher education than Black men were at times.
Oh, that's so interesting.
Yeah,
it's so interesting. I mean, it makes perfect sense now that you talk about that. But I guess it's a good reminder of how we all grow up in our own little bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
And me growing up, in northern New Jersey, kind of suburban, like that. That's just a different type of world from, other parts of the country. And so, thank you for sharing that. Yeah,
sure. Yeah. Where in northern New Jersey did you grow up?
I was in Bergen County. Like I was, Ridgewood, Glen Rock, Mahwah, that area. Yeah.
For a couple of years while I was at Howard, my mom actually got transferred to northern New Jersey. She was up in the Wayne, Booton.
Oh yeah, I know Wayne.
Plains. So I know where you were. So even though I was at Howard, I had to go home to Jersey a couple of times to visit her because she had gotten transferred from there. And my brother, I have a younger brother, 2 years younger than me. He ultimately graduated high school in Booton, New Jersey.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Small world.
Isn't it?
So how did you eventually intersect with the Yang 2020 campaign? Tell me about that journey.
Well, I know I've told this story a million times and I don't care. I'm telling it again.
I love it. I asked you. I hadn't heard it. So let's hear it.
Well, anybody who hears me knows I love to tell this story. So, and I got to tell it on the campaign trail. But long story short is back in February of 2018, I was reading an article. I opened up the New York Times that morning and acting like I opened it up. I looked on my phone and there was a story entitled "The Robots Are Coming."
Ah, yeah.
And it was an article talking about this young Asian gentleman who had just entered into the 2020 presidential race. And so in my mind, I'm thinking, 2020, I still have PTSD from 2016. Who's even thinking about 2020 right now? But sure enough, I go on and I read the article, and he's talking about the threats of automation and how that has, really impacted particularly parts of the Midwest where I'm from, and how people were hurting and drowning, and how Trump really capitalized on, that hurt and that feeling of being unheard by folks, and that he was merely a symptom and not necessarily the whole problem, and that we had to do something to address this, or it was only going to continue to get worse. And so he talked about this universal basic income. Now, I heard that, and all I could think about was my grandmother and my grandfather in my small town in Ohio, who worked at the shoe factory, who worked at the atomic plant, like most families in that area, and made a pretty decent living in the late 70s, early 80s, when you're talking about assembly line type work for folks who maybe just came straight out of high school and went to the factory to go to work. So you could be somewhat middle class in those days, but when those jobs got shipped overseas, when those jobs got automated away, nothing comparable came in to replace them. So folks got desperate, and if you could afford to move away, some did, some others did not, and the town collapsed on itself. And opioid addiction and depression and anxiety and things like that all began to set in. And as Andrew was talking in this article about we need to get money into people's hands until they can figure out what the next steps in their lives are going to be, all I could think about was what $1,000 a month would have done for my grandmother and my grandfather back in those days. If they had known that at least I've got this guaranteed income that's coming in till I can figure out what my next step is going to be, how that might have helped and changed their situation and at large our situation as a family and as a community. My town has never recovered. It's decimated. I love a lot of my family is still there, and when I go to visit occasionally, it's like time has stopped. There's no growth. There's no incentives to be there. And so in this article, when Andrew was talking about something tangible, I said, I don't know who this guy is, but I'm with him, because I've been around politics enough, particularly living here in DC, to know what political rhetoric is and to know what messages people espouse, each cycle, and that they a lot of times just turn out to be just that, messages, but never followed up with any tangible action. Andrew was talking about a tangible solution, something not just an ideal that's going to have to get through Congress, even though UBI is. But I really appreciated that. And then his mantra was humanity first. And as a preacher, I'm thinking and I'm listening to this guy, and he's talking about we've forgotten to take care of the poor, and we've left out the widowed and the single mother and those who do have addictions. We don't want to contribute to that. Where is our love for humanity? Why have we gotten away from that? And I'm thinking to myself, he's preaching what I preach every week. So I literally read that article. I wrote to the campaign because they had put an email there, and I just said, I don't know who you are, sir, but I really like what you have to say. There's a looming crisis of hope on our horizon, and we need people who are talking about solutions, tangible things, not just pie in the sky ideas. I'm here in DC. If you're ever here, I'd love to host something, a fundraiser, anything like that. But please know that I really appreciated your message. And so the campaign wrote me back like that same day and was like, hey, I think it turned out it was Carly Riley, but she's like, thank you so much, Reverend Hamilton. We really appreciate it. Of course, we're going to be in DC at some point, and, we'll let you know. And, we'd love to invite you in that. And then maybe about 15 minutes later, Andrew wrote me back himself. And I thought, now, is this the candidate? Because it was something like, Andrew Yang at Gmail. I was
like, it's like getting an email from Jeff Bezos or something. We're like, well,
right.
How is it? Yeah.
And he was like, hey, Reverend Hamilton, appreciate you reaching out so much. You get it. Would love to connect. Again, it turns out it was him, and, would love to connect you, with a couple of people. And so he connected me with somebody, and that was it. Later on, that was in February. They came down to DC for a little get together in like May or June, like a few months later. And I met with him. It was about a group of 6 of us over at the Democratic Central Committee, what's that type of place called? Like a club, like a club house where they meet. And got a chance to meet him there. I mean, I've just been on the train ever since. I just started going to different events that he would have here and introducing him, and went up to New York because I'm close to New York, and got the chance to meet and interact with folks, and finally got invited to be an official part of the campaign as a spiritual director for cultural and spiritual outreach. So what a journey.
Wow, that's amazing. What was that first in-person interaction like? It sounds like you were really moved by his vision and a lot of the things he was proposing. sometimes when you meet someone in person, you see a different, it may not kind of line up with what you were expecting. I was curious, what was that like? Kind of human to human.
It was very confirmational for me, because the humility that came across in the article came across when you met him. He was very, just nice and welcoming and inviting and friendly, and totally not, who you would have expected him to be for someone who had just thrown his name in a hat for the presidency, if you will. So it was kind of like, he comes in the door. We were all already there, kind of meeting each other and eating. And he comes in and he's like, "Hey, everybody." Hey, he's like, "Isn't this exciting?"
Yeah.
He was as excited to meet us as we were to meet him. And later on, and I get that, because even though, you're running for the presidency and that you're going to, have to build relationships and meet people, there's something, that happens on the inside of you when you actually meet people who support you. It's kind of like, okay, like this thing is actually real, because you had this group of folks in there like, we're in.
Yeah.
We're in. I mean, he hadn't even fully, gotten himself and his message developed out. We're 3 or 4 months in, and you got these folks standing there like, we're going to help you. We're going to do. So that can be sort of overwhelming too. But as you saw on the trail, Andrew just appreciates being supported, and he likes to have fun. So he was like, "You guys, this is going to be fun." So we decided we were going to work hard, but we were going to make it fun as well.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely looked like he was one of the few candidates who looked like they enjoyed being out there.
Right.
And that was kind of contagious, even virtually, just watching him on video and stuff. You can't help but get excited about that movement, right?
Yeah. Well, let me tell you, there's a difference, Tom, between doing something out of duty and doing something because you feel called.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Totally.
So,
I mean, I think that's why in some ways he had this confidence and centeredness about him, because he wasn't, like it came from a very deep place. It wasn't like, oh, I'm climbing, this is for my resume, or, I have to do this or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. Or I'm obligated to do it, or other people have expected this of me, or this is the next step on in my life path, or I'm not born to do this. I mean, he said 1,000 times, I did not wake up one morning and say, "Hey, I want to run for president." I'm not insane. But he felt a deeper call. He felt a deeper sense of responsibility in terms of being respectful to that which he was feeling he was called to. And when you can do something, it's almost like working and doing a job without getting paid for it, because you're not there just for the money. It's about your purpose. And when you're doing things that, I mean, of course you would like to get compensated for your work, but there are some things that we can do and not be able to be paid for it and still feel that is just as important that we do it. And that's kind of how Andrew approached, coming into the presidency.
Now, what was it like after Iowa for you? Like, how did you handle that outcome?
So I think at the end of the day, it was heartbreaking at first.
Mm-hmm.
It was heartbreaking, certainly, especially thinking about how many counties we traveled across on the bus tour in Iowa in, 32 degree below zero weather and slip sliding across, and, just being a part of that energy and knowing how much energy, that we put forward to Iowa. And, even times where Andrew was not feeling 100% physically.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, yet he would, get some tea and stuff while we're on the bus and just try to, get himself up so that by the time we got to the next town, at the very least, he could go out there and speak, and then come back on the bus and collapse. And, just kind of seeing those things, you just want it for him. You know what I'm saying? Because know that he's out here not to make a name for himself, but to help advance humanity and to help America, and you want him to do that. And so you work hard. You think you're doing what you're supposed to do, and then not to get the results you expect is incredibly disappointing. But in some ways, it was also relieving for us, because until that point, until Iowa, all you could go on is speculation and hopes and living and dying by the polls and the debates. And you know what I'm saying? There's all this energy invested in the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't have any way of knowing the outcome until the first votes are actually cast.
Yeah.
Once those votes were cast, it gave us an opportunity to manage our expectations better.
Yeah, it was, I kind of felt like we had these early drafts that had so much high potential, but that was the first regular season game. And you're like, oh, okay, might take a little time.
Yeah. There's like 4 or 5 other games after this.
those other teams are pretty big.
Man, they sure are. And they got more money for equipment than we do.
Yeah.
And their stadium is a little better than ours.
What do you think would have happened in South Carolina? I always thought that basic income was potentially a really powerful and fresh point of view around poverty and the African American community, and a way for the Democratic Party to actually deliver real kind of impact and not just sort of talk about, more college loans and stuff like that. But I mean, obviously he must, you guys in the campaign had access to the polls and stuff. Was it just not happening in South Carolina? Like, why not stick it out a little longer? Because it could have been very impactful for the Black community if Andrew's ideas had come to fruition.
So it would have been, and it will be, but not right now. And that's what I've been trying to help people understand and appreciate, that this election is different from any other election that we've had previously. And I'm talking from the perspective of a 52-year-old African-American woman who spent time on the ground in South Carolina talking with Black people, particularly faith leaders, and going to different places to introduce the idea of universal basic income and what it meant. And I felt like this would be a game changer if we get people to grasp the idea.
Yeah.
They were not trying to process anything new right now. This was not a change election. This was not an election for Black people where we felt like we want to try something completely new, something that's unheard of, that maybe we're not sure it might work. A lot of African Americans had some trust issues around this notion that somehow the government was going to just give you $1,000 and there was not going to be a string attached to it. Like, sorry, sis, I hear you, but the government has never given us anything where they didn't come to collect on the back end. So you had to work to fight against that, narrative, and with respecting it, because you understand that these are people's experiences and these are their feelings. And so it takes longer than a couple of months to shift that paradigm. But let me say this, that Black people in this particular election, I'm not speaking monolithically, but I'm just talking about the results. Some people seem to be shocked by the results in South Carolina. I was not shocked at all. Black people had been waiting for months to have the opportunity to vote for Joe Biden because they trust Joe Biden. And right now, when you are in an unstable climate with a person who you feel like is threatening your very existence, you don't want to go with somebody you don't know. You want to go with somebody not only that you know, but somebody that you also trust. And for better or for worse, Black older people trusted Biden. Now, I have some people who say, well, he voted for the crime bill 1994. we were not thinking about what Joe Biden did in 1994. I'm sure if we looked in your book, we'd see some things that you did in 1994, and he's since admitted that was a mistake. But let me tell you something. Black people watched Joe Biden serve as a vice president in a secondary capacity to a Black man for 8 years. And he did not try to undermine him. He did not try to usurp his authority. He did not try to undercut him in any way. And that in and of itself spoke volumes to who Joe is and was to many Black people and his character. And so that relationship was established over a period of time that meant if South Carolina had happened, if it had been the first primary as instead of Iowa or New Hampshire, the results would have been the same. We weren't waiting to see, what Iowa or New Hampshire was going to do. Y'all do what y'all need to do. We know where we're going, because at this point we want somebody that's familiar. We want somebody that we know, and we've seen Joe. Joe might have not been always on our side per se, but we're not looking back at who he was. We're looking at what our most recent experience with him has been, and it has been one that has demonstrated not only his support for African Americans, but his, again, general support for the first African-American president in the country. So those Black votes were going to be there, whether Iowa or New Hampshire went for Pete or Amy or anybody else, because that's where the mindset was. And the mindset was too, this Trump man is unstable. He's got us not sure about our futures. The one thing we do know is Joe Biden, we know, and he's not going to support the Proud Boys and tell them to stand by and stand back. This we know. And we're in election now, but yeah, there's some new and there's some interesting faces. And I like that Yang guy. A lot of Black people, they love Yang. When we talk to them, they always have positive. Oh, I like him. One lady in Detroit said, Black people can smell BS a mile away, Andrew Yang, and you don't stink.
That's fantastic. Tell me a little bit about the 94 crime bill. I've heard it's so interesting. I hear more, frankly, white people complaining about the 94 crime bill vote than Black voters. And what's striking to me is I'm pretty sure Joe Biden was not the only person who supported that crime bill. It wasn't like he secretly snuck this in the middle of the night, right?
Oh, I need a cup of tea. Oh, Jesus, that was a lot, Tom. Yeah, exactly. And I'm not even going to sit here and act as if I know exactly all that was in the crime bill in 1994, because I was fresh out of college and a single mother by that time. So I can't say that I was paying much attention to it. However, I do, believe that it had a negative impact on the Black community in terms of sentencing guidelines and all that went into it. But no. And here's another thing, and I've said this in another interview, Tom. We cannot, well, I'm not saying we can't hold people responsible or accountable, but we also have to keep our opinions and our assessments in the context of the time. What was the political climate of the time? What was happening at the time? A number of people were for it at the time. He was not the only person that voted for that particular bill. And so in order for me to hold him accountable for what vote he made in 1994, I need to go back to 1994, see what was going on, what was the public discourse and things like that. Because we are different people. I like to think that all of us operate and make choices based on the information that we have at the time. Okay? So I might have made a decision back in 1994 that somebody may go back now and say, well, Wendy, why in the world did you say this back in 1994? Because let me let you know what was going on in my life in 1994 and who I was then. I would like to think that times have changed and I would, evolve. And of course, if I look back on it now, given where we're at, I probably would have voted differently, but I don't have the luxury of looking back. I have the luxury of operating based on the information I have in that time when I'm making that choice. So what I ask for is some grace and understanding that the me that you know now is very different. And what have I demonstrated to you differently since 1994 that would suggest that I'm no longer that person or hold that belief?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's also like if you look at the voting records, a majority of the Congressional Black Caucus did vote for this same bill. I don't think the Congressional Black Caucus is anti-Black.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You have to think about the climate of the time. But again, if a person comes to you and says, yes, it was a mistake at that time, but based on who I was and what was happening, I thought it was right at the time. But don't simply judge me on that. Look at my track record since that time and let me know if what you are saying about me today bodes and meshes with who I have demonstrated and who my actions have demonstrated that I am since that time. That's how you determine if someone's attitudes have changed. And again, I will say, for Black people, watching this man, particularly older Black men, who never thought that they would ever see a white man serve a Black man in the capacity that Joe Biden did for Barack Obama, that's all they needed to see.
Yeah, I don't think he gets enough credit for being such a strong VP in the Obama administration. Like you could have imagined him distancing himself, especially when Obama got into some hot water from time to time. Like, and I think that loyalty shows me like a level of respect that, is fundamental to who he is and how he thinks about people. And I just, I hope, sometimes I feel like President Trump, when he talks about Black support, it's kind of astounding to me when he says things like, oh, no president has done more for the Black community than Trump. I feel like he's really making that speech for the suburban white women voters. Like, I think he knows that the Black community is calling BS on that. But I mean, what are your thoughts? Do you feel like, in fairness, if a Trump supporter could say, hey, Black unemployment went down to record levels under pre-COVID, that Black sort of income went up under Trump. What's your take on Trump's record?
I would honestly ask those Black people who have experienced that to come forward, because that can sound really good and that might show in the numbers but that's not playing out in households across the Black community. And so what I would, encourage folks who want to present that as a positive in terms of Trump's record on Black unemployment. Most times when he's talking about Black people, he's talking about criminal justice reform, as if all you can talk about in reference to your Black agenda is crime. And that's for Democrats and Republicans. That's a little bit offensive that when somebody first asks you about your Black agenda or what you're doing for Black America, you default to criminal justice reform. Why is that? Where are the education issues and disparities in health and housing? Why aren't those some of the things that come up? Why is your default, we're going to legalize, marijuana and let some folks out? All Black people don't smoke marijuana. But anyway, I digress. What I will say about the Trump rhetoric versus the action is, again, if you have done these things, where are the receipts? Show me, because I'm not impressed by what you say. Show me what you have done. You cannot say, well, look, I got your job numbers up, and then turn around and say, but the white supremacists in Charlottesville and Virginia, they're very fine people. See, that's what we call in the Black community the okie doke. Like you can't give us this like, see, pay no attention to the hell that I'm creating over here. Just take this money, and I gave a few more you people jobs. But then in the next tweet, you'll tell suburban white women, I'm going to protect you from these people and not let them move into your neighborhood and not let crime begin to explode again. So you're talking with a forked tongue when you do that. And so unless the gains that you are touting trickle down and across and throughout the community, you advancing the cause of 2 or 3 Black families or 200 or 300, and yet demeaning and making things more difficult for the 20 or 30,000 that live in that same community where 1 or 2 advanced, we're not impressed. So thank you. Thanks.
I was watching the town halls. As a political junkie, I could not avert my eyes. So I watched the Trump one as well. Mm-hmm. And you know, he brought up your alma mater. Mm-hmm. And he said, had it not been for the Trump administration, like Howard would be kind of on the verge of bankruptcy year to year. Mm-hmm. And that Obama never did anything for historically Black colleges and universities. And it took Trump to do it. I'm curious. I mean, you're a member of the Howard University alumni community. What's your take on that?
When he does things like that, it completely diminishes the agency of the Black alumni who have been supporting Howard University. Howard University has been around since 1867. President Obama received an honorary degree and was our commencement speaker in 2016, 2015, I want to say, and was a frequent lecturer and visitor to our campuses. I don't even know if Donald Trump could tell you where Howard University is in Washington, D.C. So he says those things, hoping that people won't do a simple Google search to see that that is not the case at all. Obama had a whole program, Am I My Brother's Keeper, that was implemented on HBCU campuses across the country. So don't just put general things out there that can be debunked by a simple Google search. And I know that it makes him feel better, you know, to pump himself up because he gave us a couple of dollars. That alone tells you that he only did that so that he could go on his town hall and say that he did that when it's not true. But he's banking on the fact that people will not take the time to go to do the research to find out how untrue that is.
In fairness to the Trump supporters, let me ask you this. A lot of people feel like the Democratic Party has taken the Black vote for granted because the Republicans have such a terrible track record. They're like, well, we don't really need to do much because, like, you're not going to go for that guy, are you? And so I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts on what you would expect from Joe Biden to kind of have higher impact and make real change?
Well, let me say something too, and I can only speak for myself. And I want to also mention that for a short time in my life, I actually was a Republican. Some people don't know that, but I was a Republican for a short time in my life because I was, very involved in the evangelical community and being involved in that community at that time, because that's who I was at that time. And that's where my understanding was. I believed that it aligned more with the Republican Party. But as I've said during this interview, we get more information, we evolve, we change. And so my thinking is much different now than it was back in, early 2000, late 90s. That being said, I want to also say this. Tom, separate Trump and Trumpism from Republican and Republicanism. For me, he is what he represents in many ways transcends either party. And I would be saying this if he was a Democrat, because I don't think that the agenda and some of the hatred and some of the divisiveness and that he's pushing is reflective of the entire Republican Party. So in this instance, what do I expect Joe Biden to do for the Black community? Not sell us out. You know what I'm saying? Not tell us one thing and do another. Is he going to be able to do everything he's promised? No. But do I believe that he's a man of his word and that he will try to do it? Yes, much more so than I believe Donald Trump would do that. But I'm saying all of that to say, for me, Trump in many ways has diminished the Republican brand. in my mind and in many folks' minds, because I have known many Republicans and still am friends with Republicans, many of them who can be reasonable, who can sit down and we have a conversation. I used to work on Capitol Hill for a short time for George Voinovich. He's passed away, but he was a moderate Republican at the time. He had been the mayor of Cleveland and the governor of Ohio. And so I was his communications assistant during that time that I was Republican, and he was known as a moderate. Because he was big on environmental issues because of all the Great Lakes, in Ohio, and he was a proponent of that. So he used to work very diligently across the aisle to make gains in environmental issues and stances. And so when I think about Republicanism, that's what I think about. Folks who they shared some difference, but they were willing to come to the table and sit down and talk and not get on Twitter later and call you out your name and demean you and tell you one thing and then, go and do the exact opposite. I don't associate what Trump is doing or who he's being with the entire Republican brand, although it does not help when it seems as though many Republicans are enabling this behavior. But I would like to think that once we have gotten beyond this phase of Trumpism, that some normalcy and some maturity will be restored to the Republican Party, where we can go back to having, general, common, human, mature conversations again about our differences that don't have to become, a threat and chance of lock her up and throw away the key to our, fellow Democratic governors or whomever because you don't like them.
Well, as a former Republican myself, I certainly agree that there's a lot of probably millions of fantastic, open-minded, reasonable Republicans out there. I cannot ignore the fact that recent polls show that within the Republican Party, President Trump's approval rating is somewhere between 80 and 90%. Mm-hmm. Today's Republican Party, not the Republican Party of the 90s or early 2000s.
Right.
And that just is striking to me because I grew up when the Republican Party was all about, they would talk about family values and honesty and honor and loyalty and telling the truth. And responsible spending, so all these things. And you've got this guy who, if you went in a time machine and you talk to like an early 90s Republican and you're like, oh yeah, so there's this guy, Donald Trump, he's spending all this money and he on his third marriage and all this stuff, people would probably say, oh, that's one of those Democrats, So I do worry a little bit. Like, I agree with you. We should separate Trump and Trumpism from the Republican Party, but he has massive influence with majority of today's Republican Party. Do you see a way to kind of what does the world look like? What do you think is going to look like when Trump eventually is no longer president for one reason or another?
It's hard to access your humanity and your conscience when it's constantly under attack. And so what I would like to, and with the style of, in my opinion, pathological narcissism that Trump displays, it's almost like being in an abusive relationship where you want to express how you really feel, but you cannot do that for various reasons. And so you just go along and you drop the charges and you don't show up at court and you don't tell, you know what I'm saying? Because there's some things that have happened where you don't feel like or remember that you can, and that you have power to be able to do that. I'd like to hope that in some regards, some of these folks, once that presence is removed, never to come back again, for whatever reason, that they will come to themselves. That they will come back to themselves and they'll say, you know what? I never agreed. I'm not a party to that. I never spoke up. I never said anything. So I don't believe anybody's beyond redemption. Don't get me wrong. But I'm saying that for some of these folks, I think they are just a little bit sort of bamboozled, a little hoodwinked, if you will, and don't really feel empowered to express how much they are in disagreement with what's happening because, for fear of different repercussions. And I would just like to believe that once that threat is removed, that they will feel more empowered to come back to themselves and who they are and to be that and connected to that which they claimed that was their reason for identifying as Republican in the first place.
I'm going to need you to channel your optimistic, hopeful side in a second, because as much as I agree, there are some people who feel like they've kind of made their bed with Trump and they just have to stick with him through it, and for whatever reasons.
Right.
I also feel like I've seen enough video interviews with some Trump supporters who really are very very angry, and they have a lot of anger about different types of people and different types of things in the world. That they didn't learn that from Donald. That was in them before, and he may have given them permission to say it out loud, and sometimes now in front of cameras. But they may have been saying that privately for a long time.
Sure. And
as someone, admittedly, who's only lived on the coasts, it's been shocking to me because I'm like, whoa, I didn't know. I thought that sort of anger about other races and people, other religions, even. I thought that was like from the 60s and 70s and a difficult transitional point for the country. How do you see us bridging this gap? Because I also see in some of those same videos children in the presence of these people saying very hateful things, and I'm thinking to myself, well, this kid is hearing their father or their mother screaming about communists, about rioters, Antifa, Chinese, whatever, you name it. And I'm thinking, shoot, I hope what's going to happen when that kid runs into my kid in the workplace or, on Main Street? How do you feel like we get out of this? Because I never realized how sort of divided we were, but it's clearly it's visceral right now.
Did you miss the Obama years or no?
Well, yeah, I guess during the Obama years, yeah, you mean like with the birtherism and just all of the.
I'm like, Tom, this ain't new. It may be more pronounced, but this, it was really bad then.
Yeah.
And
maybe you're right. So you're saying it's welcome to reality, Tom.
Yeah. Well, glad to have you. Come on in. The water's fine. But no, with all due respect, I would like to believe that even though our children see these things, their lived experiences are very different than those of the people that they're seeing and those of the adults around them and stuff like that. So imagine when Obama was elected and the inauguration and everything was on television and a Black man was being sworn in as president. And you being a child or someone who's grown up in a household where somebody has told you Black people are inferior, they can never be anything, they can't, and the child is looking at that and saying, but mom, dad, you're saying that Black people, but I'm seeing that this Black man is sworn in as president. So some people said that the election of Obama broke people's brains. Because it stopped, it sort of interrupted this idea of perpetuating that Black people were inferior in some way. Well, maybe it didn't, maybe it didn't. Now we've gotten to this place where maybe some of those folks, they weren't being amplified as much, but now they've got someone who they feel like is giving them permission to re-amplify that again. But if you look at the young people and how people are turning out and how they're pushing back against those images, and even if you look at some of the Black Lives Matter protests that happened all across the country, Tom, this, especially this time when George Floyd passed away, it was such a pivotal shift to see how many different races all around the world were coming together and saying Black lives matter, from a philosophical standpoint. I'm not talking about what, the political aspects that they've tried to turn it into and all of that, but, declaring our own humanity and affirming our humanity through that philosophy that Black Lives Matter was supported by people across the board. So I say all that to say, I think our future is bright. And I know that our democracy is way, way bigger than one man or one administration. And we will bounce back. I mean, he's taking up all the air in the room right now, but he is only one person. This democracy was here before he got here. It's going to be here long after he is gone. And I have a faith in the American people and in the spirit and the resilience that's within people, that everybody has the capacity to grow and to change and to move beyond that. And sometimes it just takes the majority to move us in that direction. And at some point, these types of reactions and stuff like that, that people, things that you're talking about, we used to frown upon. People yelling, calling people out their name, calling the N-word and all that kind of stuff in the store or at the Target, or calling the police on Black people that were sleeping in the park. We used to call them out and say, hey, what are you doing? Stop that. And we'll get back to that. We're just in a kind of a sliver of time right now where it doesn't really feel safe because of what's being modeled in terms of leadership, and what's being said and articulated would be repercussions for standing up, and defending what we believe in, or what we feel like, this country should be standing for and reflecting. So I have hope, because again, things might look bad now, but I don't believe that we have gone so far that we can't turn this ship around. We all thought that, the Bush years, not all, but a lot of people thought that, oh my gosh, America's going to go under after the Bush years and things like that. And we bounced back because this country has been here and it's going to be here. And it's going to take all of us to make sure that we right the ship, put it back on, the course that we want it to be on. And I still believe that that's possible.
Rev, let me ask you about BLM stuff. I feel like the violent protesters, or just straight up rioters and arsonists, really did a disservice to the BLM kind of narrative, and have given the Trump campaign a way to just quickly dismiss all of the peaceful protests that, to your point, were multicultural and multi-generational. And I'm just wondering, do you feel like those of us who do support BLM and folks in the African American community have how do you think we should handle cases where protest becomes more than protest? It becomes just rioting and looting and arson. How do you balance that? Because on the one hand, you don't want to dismiss people's frustration and kind of understandable anger. At the same time, it doesn't feel constructive.
Well, I think at the end of the day, people are going to do and be who they are. And I totally, I support, rioting is the language of the unheard, right? And when I'm not one here to judge why people riot or why they loot, because I don't know the circumstances regarding what prompted them to get to that place. I do know in some riot situations, in some looting situations, people are stealing Pampers and they're stealing, milk and things like that to get by. And I would like to also think that the pandemic and economic anxiety that's been happening with what's going on in our economy has driven a lot of what we saw over the summer as well. But at the end of the day, as long as we know what we're out there to do and we are setting the example for folks, we just have to trust that people are going to follow that. We can't get the message out there and reinforce the peacefulness while getting distracted and focusing on the few who have decided to be violent. And so there's a balance, I think, that has to be struck. And so, yeah, Trump might have pointed to one or two, but again, he's pointing to extreme situations that occurred maybe around 10% of the country, but the 90%, the rest of the country was peaceful and was demonstrating and trying to get the message out there. And so you kind of saw him usurp and distort what the efforts were. But it hasn't, in my mind, it has not diminished the reason that folks were there in the first place. And I think what Black Lives Matter leaders are trying to remind folks is that don't move away or stray from the message. We can do our best to work with communities, to work with leadership, law enforcement, whoever we need to work with in terms of the method, but don't allow yourselves to be caught off, to be drawn off by distractions that lead us away ultimately from the message itself. And so again, like I said, Trump has a way of taking up all of the oxygen in the room and making it, things be bigger than what they are. I am not someone who condones, going in and looting or rioting, but at the same time, I don't know what's prompting you to do that. I don't know what your story is. I don't know, what is going on in your mind. And maybe, maybe it's not. Maybe you're looking at it as an opportunity. But the time I take to try to figure that out and to get you to, I'm losing time on directing my energy toward the message. So you're always going to have people who are going to come in and exploit and attempt to distract what it is that you are trying to achieve. But you have to balance that with understanding that we have to let the agencies and folks that are in place take care of that, but we can't stray away from our message. We can't lose focus because those things are going to happen. We have no control over that. What we can control is how we respond.
So speaking of focusing on the message, by the way, I know we're running a little over time. Do you have a few minutes to keep going for a little bit?
I got a couple minutes. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me just maybe wrap up with this question about the BLM message, because I 100% support the fact that any life matters, and any kind of unfair treatment of a group based on their race is unacceptable.
Right.
And I've seen enough video evidence to know, like, this is not just like a one-off thing. Like, this is a real problem.
Right. And
frankly, like, if white police officers were beating crap out of Asian people, I would be livid. So I get it. At least, like, I don't get it completely, but I share the frustration and the outrage. However, I would also say, like, I don't necessarily agree with everything that's on the official BLM website, that has all these like specific policy proposals. And I've had this debate, frankly, with members of my family who are in the Trump camp, and they're like, "Oh, so you agree we should destroy the family and all this stuff that they find on the BLM website?" And I'm like, I don't know what the BLM website is. Like, I support a movement around fairness in law enforcement and training of law enforcement and equal protection under the law. That BLM website, that's a bunch of organizers. That's fine, but this is bigger than any one group. This is more of a movement. How do you think about that?
It's a movement and it's a philosophy. There is no Black Lives Matter organizational structure that has an agreed upon and voted upon agenda. Some folks have tried to craft something like that. But when we say Black Lives Matter, we're simply saying, we're not saying that, only Black Lives Matter. We're simply saying that in the construct, and it's not even just about police brutality. And I'm also kind of upset that the message has been co-opted simply to highlight brutality in the Black community, which is definitely prevalent. But when I say Black Lives Matter, and let me just speak for me, because I can't speak for the entire Black community, and we're not monolith. But let me tell you something. The first time I was called the N-word, Tom, was in the 4th grade by my Catholic school 4th grade teacher, who was a nun. And I'm sitting in the classroom. I was the only African-American young lady in this classroom. Me and my cousin, we were the only 2 African-Americans in this small Catholic school in Southern Ohio. And I used to raise my hand when she would ask the class, a question and throw it out there. And I'd raise my hand, and she never called on me. And at first I was like, well, maybe she didn't see me, or maybe she's calling on the first hand that went up. I'm just kind of going through these things in my mind because I'm like 9 or 10 years old. So finally, one day, Tom, I went over to her desk and I said to her, Sister Orlet, I said, I raised my hand and you never call on me. And she said, Wendy, I never call on you because niggers couldn't possibly know the answers to the questions that I'm asking. Mm. And I thought, did I hear what she just, and it was shocking because I knew that word. I had, of course, been taught to understand what that word meant, but I had never had it directed toward me. I had never experienced it in that way. And I simply put my head down. I went back to my desk and I kind of put my head down because we were near the end of the day. I didn't want to cry because I didn't want to feel weak. I didn't want to show her how hurt I really was. And it wasn't until I got out in my car, my mom came to pick me up from school that day, and I just bust into tears. And my mother was like, what's wrong? And I told her what happened. Sister Orland called me. And I didn't even finish the sentence. My mother, all I saw was her coat out of the back door of the car. And she was in that school, in the principal's office, like right now. I need to talk to somebody right now. And, they profusely apologized. And she admitted it. She didn't come down. She was afraid to come down to the office. Go figure. And so the principal agreed that next day to move me. There were 2 4th grade classrooms. So the next day they moved me. Not her. She got to keep her job. They moved me to the classroom. And I can remember my mother saying to me in that moment that, Wendy, Sister Orlet is ignorant. And that is pure ignorance. And you're going to come across that in your lifetime. And it's up to you to determine how you process it and what you do with it. But just know that her saying that to you speaks more about who she is than it does about who you are. And in a sense, that was my first your life will always matter, regardless of how other people view it, see it, or label it. So when I say Black Lives Matter, it's for all of those children who have been told or taught that they were less than, that they were inferior, that they weren't smart enough, they couldn't grasp particular concepts and information. No, our lives matter too. And for so many years, we have fought against the notion that they didn't, that when we stand up just to remind people that they do, it doesn't mean that we're just diminishing the worth or the value of anyone else's. We're just asking for a little additional affirmation.
Well, I am so sorry to hear about that experience you had as a 4th grader. I can't imagine, but I have to believe that it probably affected you for some time. And yeah, I mean, I 100% agree that the topic of Black Lives Mattering, it's easy to focus on the police brutality, but I think many of us are unwilling to acknowledge like the long-term, it's a very complex, multi-layered issue that goes back many, many generations. Mm-hmm. And I was having a debate with a Trump supporter about this a couple months ago. And that person was saying like, hey, it's not my fault. I didn't do any of this. I didn't own slaves or whatever. And I was trying to kind of walk that person through like, well, imagine if you were born in different circumstances and you had to try and, get called on in class or get help. Maybe both your parents weren't there at your elbow every time you had to do your homework, because of a variety of like economic situations or generational issues. And then you're in a job interview and your name's, is not John Smith, something else. And people kind of draw conclusions about it. And what I noticed is that there is a general allergic reaction because I think some people feel like, oh, they're being blamed individually. And I wonder, like, how do we get out of this? Hey, no one's saying it's your fault, individually. but we as a society have to acknowledge like the complex kind of inheritance that we have as a country have. But that's not a quick bumper sticker conversation.
It's not, but it can be broken down, Tom, into this. You may not have owned slaves. Well, what have you done to condone racism in your community, in your circle? So it's not about the slavery. It's not all about the slavery. It's about the sort of remnants of slavery that still exist in our. And so some people will say, well, I don't support, or they'll say, well, you know, Donald Trump is not a racist. And some people say that he is. And then I say, I can't, I'm not, you know, here to call anybody racist. I don't know what's ultimately in people's hearts. And again, I don't believe anybody can't be changed. But at the end of the day, even though if you might believe that Donald Trump isn't a racist, or people who support him aren't racist, many of us can agree that there have been some racist tinged behaviors. And if those are not a deal breaker for you, then that makes me wonder, then if you're not racist, how come racism then is not a deal breaker for you when you see it on display? That just might make me think, you know, be a little bit hesitant to trust what you're saying, because you cannot, I mean, in some instances, you cannot necessarily separate the messenger from the message. And I, for one, believe that those conversations have to be a little bit more nuanced than just slavery, because people's defenses automatically go up when you say slavery. Yeah, well, no, well, I didn't own slaves. Yeah, you may not have owned slaves, but when is the last time you participated in a conversation where you maybe saw some outright racism happening in your workplace? Did you stand up? Did you say anything? You know, when you're standing around the water cooler and there's some conversations talking about that black man named Hakeem who applied for the job, and you heard the supervisor say, I threw his resume in the garbage can. I'm not hiring somebody. I'm not interviewing Hakeem. What was your response then? You know, when you saw, black people standing on the side of the road trying to catch a cab in New York, and the cab drove past him and picked you up. Did you ask the cab driver why he passed the guy that was standing right there, he passed before he passed you? Did you happen to say anything about that? And if not, why not? If you're not for slavery, if you're not your forefathers, if you don't support or condone any of those behaviors, and yet my experience with you seems to, actions speak louder than words. Again, we're back to that same theme again, Tom, and you have to understand, we're Black people, we are much more actions oriented than we are words oriented. So you can tell us a whole bunch of stuff, but if you don't have a track record to back it up, or if what you do is completely opposite, we already have sort of a distrust that's a leftover from slavery. But yeah, I'm not trusting anything you say, because I'm looking at what you do and they're complete opposites.
Rev, I want to ask one last question from the audience, and then we'll wrap. Landline wants to know, what would you say to Black supporters of Trump without invalidating their views and acknowledging that, that's their right to support who they want? What have you encountered Black Trump supporters, and what are those conversations like? That's exactly what I say to them. Like, I don't agree, but we can, agree to disagree without being disagreeable. I have Black Trump supporting friends that I know, and particularly a lot that are in the church and in the evangelical community. And so I may not, again, it goes back to understanding people's experience. And that's why I said I'm not speaking monolithically for Black people. I'm just speaking out of my own experience, and one that, is rooted in 52 years of growing up as a Black woman in America. But I don't, the Black Trump supporters that I know, like I said, and there are quite I got a cousin, and he and I had a phone conversation, and I said, cousin, I don't get it. I don't understand, but I know that
in speaking with him, a lot of his life experience is different than mine. And so that has shaped who he is. And so we have to also be willing to acknowledge that our life experiences shape who we become and what we come to believe about ourselves and about the world. And so what I try not to do is diminish anyone because of their life experience. I may not understand it, and I may shake my head and be like, okay, but at the end of the day, I'm not going to, just dismiss you out of hand, because that's how you see the world. And so I just agree to disagree and try to do that without being disagreeable.
Well, thanks, Rev. I feel like we'll have to have you back on soon. I feel like we could talk for a long time, and there's so much more that we could unpack. But maybe we'll save that for your next visit to the Nerd Zone.
Yeah, absolutely, Tom. And thank you so much for your time and for your platform. I appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who tuned in, and go vote. Please.
Indeed. And for folks who weren't familiar with you before, Rev, how do they kind of stay in touch and follow what your thoughts are and stay connected to what you're working on?
Well, of course, you can follow me on Twitter at RevWendy3. And so a lot of folks follow me there. That's where they, came into contact with me. I also have a YouTube channel, The Community of Compassion. And so that's more ministry related. So on Sunday mornings, I do a spirit talk, a brief 15 to 20 minute motivational, uplifting talk. I do those every week to keep us connected to our spirits as well. And then I'm on Facebook. So Twitter, YouTube are my primary, and then Facebook as well. And maybe next time when we come together, Tom, I'll have some news to share for you.
Oh, I love where that's going. I love where that's going, because we know you like to communicate. There are a lot of ways that you can be a full-time communicator. Fantastic. Well, you heard it here first, that there might be news, and we'll wait for the next time you're on.
All right.
To share more details about that. In the meantime, let's everybody vote on November 3rd or beforehand.
Frankly. If it's early, go now. Yeah. Beat the lines. Although the early vote lines are just as long as the election day line.
Seriously. Vote your conscience. Do the right thing. And with that, we'll have you back on very soon, Wendy. But for today, we're going to say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.